Greetings and good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Roberts from Point 32 Health and its family of companies, including Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare and Tufts Health Plan. I'm honored to be joined this afternoon by the wonderful Amishi Jha, neuroscientist, professor, mindfulness researcher, best-selling author, and we are hoping this will be a very interactive Q&A with you, our audience. Towards those ends, we would love to invite you to open up the chat feature on your screen. Send along any questions you may have at any time, which shows when those questions are occurring to you. Also look out for, in the chat, links that we'll be placing in there to other free public wellness resources that we offer, as well as our Peak Mind Resource Hub, which is the online home of our ever-expanding collaboration with Dr. Jha. And if you're watching this as a recording, please note those links will be available in the notes right below this video. Amishi, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
All right, so just to get us started, for those who are not already familiar with your work, I'd like to start by going back to your best-selling book, Peak Mind, which, dare I say, is perhaps even more relevant today than it was when it came out in 2022. Now, the subtitle of your book, Peak Mind, is the following: Find your focus, own your attention, invest 12 minutes a day. I'd like to dissect that sentence, if I may, starting with finding our focus. Why is it important to find our focus, and where did it go to in the first place?
Yeah, such a thank you for breaking it down in that way. And it ends up that, yeah, each of those short phrases are quite meaningful to me and are informed a lot by not only what I describe in the book, but what we've been up to in my lab and conducting research in this topic for the last almost 20 years. So let's start with the finding our focus, right? One of the aspects of our human experience that is pervasive and powerful and surprisingly most unknown to us is the mind's tendency to wander. And it ends up that about 50% of our waking moments, our attention is not in our intended task at hand. Even more prominent is the fact that when our attention is not on the task at hand, we are unaware that our attention has drifted away. My lab actually just published a paper in which we took 10,000 study participants. We aggregated across published data, 68 studies or so. And we saw that when you look kind of moment by moment of people's task performance, there's an increasing uptick in how often they mind wander. So by the time we are 20 minutes into any task that you're doing, these were mostly laboratory-based tasks, you are 50% likely to not be able to fully engage in the task. So why is find your focus important? Primarily because if we want any hope of being able to use our attention successfully for all the things we'll need it for, we need to know where it is. And so this aspect of knowing where we are, where our mind is something we're going to need to cultivate, because by default, we're not so great at it. So that key phrase was motivated by that knowledge of 50% mind wandering.
Well, this is amazing to hear, Amishi, because I think a lot of people, myself included, might think, oh, the longer I focus on a task, the more I'm going to get into it, the more I'm going to really be able to focus. But what I'm hearing you say is that, in fact, the longer that we think we're focusing, the less likely it is that we're actually focusing.
It depends on the task, obviously, right? Because there's always some kind of warm-up. But let's say we consider you actually being in the task after that warm-up is over and you're fully doing it. So, for example, if you're trying to write an email, it's not find the thing on your computer and figure out what you're going to say. It's like you're literally starting to draft. Or if you're reading a book, the page is open, your eyes are actually moving down the page. So our data would really reflect the initiation of the actual task in earnest, and then looking at the ticking clock of the rates of mind wandering moment by moment. I always think about this in the context of really high stakes circumstances, like a surgeon. 20 minutes into surgery, they are more likely to be mind wandering than at the beginning of the surgery. This is just sort of left unchecked without anything else in place. Or a pilot, or, think of any number of tasks in which continuous performance and attention are required. A student in a classroom, et cetera. So that's really what we're talking about.
Well, so that is indeed a little bit of a startling realization there. But here's the second part of your title, which I think is maybe going to be the beginning of the solution, which is owning our attention. So if it is so easy to have our focus challenged, what does it mean to own our attention? I mean,
Right. So this is really sort of the intention behind that phrase is the empowering of ourselves. In order to, because we didn't even talk about this yet, but I think this, I know everybody that's listening has considered this. We're not living in an attentionally neutral environment. We are living in the middle of the attention economy, in which every time you interface with any kind of technology, there is a war that is taking place. And that is essentially the resources of your own mind are the product that these platforms are aiming to mine and consume. So, given that, if we just do nothing in response to the current climate that we're in, we will get consumed, meaning that you'll be on Instagram looking at reel after reel after reel, or you'll be going down a rabbit hole of hyperlinking in an unending way. So, the owning your attention is empowering ourselves to know that we need to put some active effort into not only finding our focus, but repeatedly and consistently monitoring where it is and taking it back.
Yeah, so I love your use of the term empower and the activity involved, because it's often it does feel like we are just being sort of controlled by some of the machines that we've brought into our lives. But and I think this is where the third part of the title becomes so important. This number 12, the 12 minutes a day, what we can do in 12 minutes a day, which will help us to own our attention and find our focus. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, that's where, your team is key for that, because essentially the 12 minutes comes, the number itself, we can talk about how we came to that, but the bigger question was, what can you do? What should you be doing for whatever time that is? And we tried many things in the context of seeing that people were more prone to distractibility the longer they spent on a task or over high stress intervals. We tried various forms of brain training, so computer games that sort of like, there's commercially available products too, of like exercising your attention by doing attention tasks. There are technology facilitated solutions like, light and sound devices that can help you. There are maybe nutrition and sleep. I mean, there's so many different ways in which we can try to empower and strengthen our brain functioning. But the key that we were looking for is something that people could do consistently to not only strengthen, but protect against this decline that will happen. And out of all the different things that we tried, the only thing that we were able to, and have still to this date been able to find consistently protects and strengthens attention, is mindfulness training. So the 12 minutes a day number comes from many studies in which we've offered people mindfulness training, and we've varied either how much we asked them to do or how much they tell us they did to pinpoint sort of the minimum effective dose, so that if they do about this much, we see benefits. If they do less, we really don't. The really good news, even with that number 12, is so far in the broader literature and even in our own work, if you do more than that minimum effective dose, you benefit more. And that's what's really neat about the brain, is that, in some sense, the brain is no different than the body. If we engage in exercises, the more we engage in those reliably and consistently, the more we benefit.
Wonderful. And I think it's worth mentioning, and you were gesturing towards us very kindly, that at our Peak Mind Resource Hub, you can access a number of guided meditations that our team has put together in collaboration with Amishi, based upon the meditation techniques which she has actually studied in her research. So that's also wonderful to hear about. That it's so if 12 minutes is the threshold under which maybe you're not seeing as many effects as you want to, you will still start to see more effects after 12 minutes. Is that right?
You got it.
Very good. All right. And also, for folks who are going to the chat to look for those links, please also do drop in any questions that you may have. We do want to welcome audience questions. So anything that comes to mind, please do let us know. Now, Amishi, those of us in the business world are quite used to thinking about how particular tools and techniques can help us to strengthen focus and attention. And so it's always great to hear when those tools and techniques can be efficacious in as few as 12 minutes a day. But I understand there's a whole world of benefits to these practices beyond just focus and attention, including, for example, boosting or improving mood. I'm just wondering if you could describe the mechanism behind that and why boosting mood might be an important effect or side effect, as important perhaps as improving attention or focus?
Yeah, I think this is something that I often get questions about. It's like, well, you're talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness is an entire universe of things, and it has, sort of profound connection to the world's wisdom traditions. Many people go to take on mindfulness practices not simply to improve their attention, but because they want deeper meaning, fulfillment. They want a spiritual connection. They want emotion regulation. They want social connection. And why are you so obsessed with attention? Is one of the things I get back. So one of the things to say at the outset is I am interested in all of those things, but my expertise is as an attention researcher, and my journey to mindfulness was not from any other route, but to understand better how to strengthen and protect attention. So my focus ends up being on this system of attention. And through that lens, I'm looking to see how mindfulness could be a useful tool. So having said that, I want to actually answer your question from that perspective, because that's the one I can speak from with most, knowledge and expertise. So it ends up that if we look at the broader literature, on all of the studies done now over the past, let's say 30 years, right, there's been a dramatic increase, sort of meteoric rise in how many people have been studying mindfulness, which is wonderful, with manualized programs where we know exactly what people got, comparing them to a group that didn't get it, et cetera. There are multiple domains in which we see benefits, and I put them sort of into 4 broad categories, but there are more. The 4 main ones would be there's benefits to cognitive functioning, like attention, memory, et cetera. There's benefits to what we might perceive as, certainly broadly speaking, other aspects of the mind, psychological health and well-being. And this is where the mood question comes in, and I will get to that in a second. There's benefits to our social functioning, our ability to have team cohesion, connection, better relationships. And then finally, sort of our performance in the world, whether that's academic performance, workplace performance. And actually, I'd even add one more in, which is our physical wellness. So if you kind of think of the person and sort of a wheel and spokes, there are so many different aspects in which this core training in mindfulness can be beneficial. The question that I've been interested in is, well, how does it work, right? So that's great that it does seem to work and have multiple benefits. If you look at the mechanisms and you kind of get into the granular details of what mindfulness instructions are honing in on, attention is at the center of those, right? The most fundamental way to think about mindfulness is present-centered, non-judgmental attention. So attention's already in the description of this mental mode we all possess. And when we think of fundamental exercises that are part of most mindfulness training programs, attention is key to those as well, whether it's focusing on the breath, noticing when the mind wanders, and returning it, or open monitoring, or body scans. All of these have attention in them. So I would say, even though I happen to be interested in attention, it is the case that there is a very natural relationship between the topic of mindfulness and attention and its centrality. And it ends up that attention is extremely important for emotions. Then there's 3 main ways in which this relationship is there. And this is separate from mindfulness, but it goes to why this mood boosting feature, which has been repeatedly found with mindfulness training, may emerge, at least from my point of view. So, and this has to do with understanding what attention is. So let me just briefly say sort of 3 ways we can think about attention, because it's actually not one thing. One way we can think about attention is that it has to do with selecting and narrowing information, right? Put your mind on something, that's the thing that's the focus. Everything else around you is not relevant. Let's just dig into how that type of attention may relate to mood. If you want to experience an emotion, and in fact, when you do experience an emotion, you will not be able to do so without your attention. So fundamentally, the experience of emotion requires attention. And I always think about this every time I'm in a situation, and I encourage other people to do this too. It could be helpful. Think about the most delicious piece of chocolate or sip of wine or whatever it is that is a wonderful sensory experience for you. If you were distracted, you missed it. You missed out on the moment of actually embodying that emotion. And why is that? Because that attentional resource was somewhere else. So the experience of that emotional occurrence did not happen. So to experience emotion, we need our attention. The second part is that another way to think about attention is it's not about narrowing and selecting, but it's about being broad and receptive to whatever is occurring. So we might use the term alert, being alert. When it comes to our emotions, this alertness aspect is what allows us to understand the kind of emotional climate that we are experiencing in this moment. Like, there's a little bit of nervousness, or I'm feeling a little, and there's anticipation. Whatever that is requires sort of a broad ability to watch what's happening in this sort of emotional domain of our experience, to pull it out and report it back to ourselves, which again ties back to our experience. So attention is narrow, involves emotion by experiencing it. Attention is broadening, involves emotion by surveying it. The third way, and this is probably most related to your question about boosting mood and mindfulness, is we need our attention to regulate our emotions. So emotion regulation requires attention. And it's this particular system of attention called executive functioning. So this system is like the executive of a company. Its job is to ensure that the goals of what the system wants to do, whether it's an organization or the person, and the actions align. And when there is a problem, like the actions and goals don't align, you've got to course correct. And that's what this executive functioning does. It monitors and manages attention. When it comes to emotion, we want to be able to, let's say, have proportionate emotional experience and expression, right? Something happens to us, we don't want to be flying off the handle. Like somebody cuts you off in traffic, you don't want to be hunting them down and being in a rage-filled episode. That is what you want to avoid. So what happens in that moment? You've got the desired state, be regulated, and you've got your action, and then you're constantly maneuvering between those two. So that's just to say, attention and emotion are strongly related to each other. What we know from mindfulness training is that all three aspects of attention are targeted and trained with mindfulness training. So it may be the case that with this better resource of attentional functioning, we can better experience emotions at will, better survey what's happening with our emotions, and better regulate our emotions as we desire. And so far in the literature, that seems to be the case, because what we find repeatedly is when people engage in mindfulness training programs, their well-being, self-reported well-being goes up, their anxiety levels go down, depression symptoms are more regulated. So overall, the profile looks to be that mindfulness is helpful for mood boosting.
Well, that is fascinating, Amishi, because so it sounds like attention really is the gateway to human experience, including regulating or, let's say, contextualizing our emotions, understanding where our emotions may be serving us well or may be challenging us in perhaps
Yeah.
unhelpful ways. It also sounds like attention is helping us to really appreciate the good things in life, and also to maybe not catastrophize the bad things.
Yes, but here's the other thing I want to say about this, because I want to not paint an overly cheery picture here, because it actually gets people into trouble. Oftentimes with this sort of knowledge that, oh, mindfulness helps you have better mood. There are many misguided views that when people begin practicing mindfulness training, they will not experience negative mood, that they will not become dysregulated, that they may not survey their own mind and find that their mind and heart are very unwell. That's not the case at all. In fact, we have to be prepared that when we use this tool of present-centered, non-judgmental attention, we will find what there is if we're looking as we should be. But the good news is that there are other aspects of what mindfulness training offers that can help us manage what comes up in a more productive and less harmful manner for ourselves. So for example, if a strong emotion comes up, there is this tool of what we call psychological distancing or decentering, being able to watch the emotion and its entire sort of arc without being caught up in it or having to hold on to it in some way as if it's never going to change. So even when there are moments of negativity and strong emotion takes us over, we can ride that wave and kind of get back to steady with more ease, understanding that we can approach our emotional experience from this mindful perspective. But it's not the case that you are going to be blissfully happy if you practice mindfulness. And if people think that, it's probably even more likely that they're not going to experience a lot of happiness.
That's right. It feels like such an important point. I'm thinking about where you are physically right now, Amishi, where there is, as you said, there were storms coming up, and I feel like what I'm hearing you say is that practicing mindfulness, even 12 minutes a day, isn't going to mean that these mental or emotional storms don't sometimes arise. But as you said to me at the beginning of our session, you were sort of preparing me, like, well, we might, lose power and everything. And this is, I feel like this is the mindful turn, just like knowing that the storm is coming, not pretending it's not happening, but just preparing for it more effectively.
Preparing for it and maneuvering through it moment by moment
Beautiful,
with
beautiful.
some
So we
kind of
have
mental agility. Yeah.
to get a question from the chat here. Somebody's asking, do we need to practice 12 straight minutes per day, or can we break it up throughout the day?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I wish I had like a ready answer from the empirical data. We have not done that, right? We have not done the study because it's a tricky thing to do, to say, okay, now do 2 minutes here, now do 3 minutes here. But I'll tell you two things that may inform our understanding. When people do practice continuously is when we see benefits because we're assigning them to do so. So that's just to say the data that I'm talking about is continuous practice. So on the one hand, I encourage that because that's what I can lean on the most heavily. The tradition suggests this too, that there's something about engaging in this sort of stillness approach that provides almost, you'd say, the resistance training we need, sort of like the physical model of resistance training. Because if you do 2 or 3 minutes, you may not really be able to bathe in that internal distractibility that can be really good for exercising the coming back and returning of our attention when our mind wanders away. So on the one hand, I'd say do as much stillness practice where you're doing it continuously as you can. The other thing I'll tell you is that many small moments, many times a day, has been found to be beneficial. So I'll give you an example from the work that we've done in which we've tracked this. And it's a very different context than most probably encounter. This was a project we did with uh, people that were, these were military service members, or not even military service members yet, but they were in basic combat training. And we were doing a formal mindfulness training, but we also wanted to offer multiple ways in which they could just sort of become more mindful in the moment. As people are in this early stage of military training, they have to do certain physical postures multiple times a day. One probably all of us have heard of is standing at attention, right? So soldiers often practice standing at attention. They stand at parade rest, which is a different posture, or they stand at ease. What we did is we said, every time you do one of those types of postures, use that as a mindful moment. And we gave them specific guidance on how to orient their mind in a mindful way toward those different postures. And what we found is the more moments people did those various, what we'd call embedded practices, the more they benefited on a variety of things, including their mood, including their report of team cohesion, physical pain, and even how mentally tough they felt they were by the end of the time they were in basic combat training. So I would say try both. So far, it looks like both are definitely helpful. And again, for both, it is the case that the more you do, the more you benefit.
And this is a great point, I think, or great point in the conversation to give us a little bit of clarification, which is there are, in the biz here, we often talk about formal versus informal meditation, with formal meditation being what you might imagine if you were sort of sitting with your eyes closed and concentrating on your breath, for example, or something of that sort, versus informal, which would be more just, trying to pay close attention to the person you're speaking with, and not allowing your thoughts to be distracting you, things like that. So when we talk about the 12 minutes per day, we are talking about formal meditation.
Yes.
And is there, could that be substituted with by more informal techniques?
I mean, I could say, we don't know yet. I would say not substituted, supplemented is what I would say.
Mhm.
So don't abandon the formal approach, but the more, and you use the term informal, which I think is great, but a related concept is embedded. So embedded is not just informal, meaning opportunistically, which you should try to do, right? We're not doing mindfulness practice for some abstract reason. We're doing it to increase the prevalence of this mental mode and our access to it in our moment to moment lives. That's the point. So it shouldn't be an afterthought to try to be more embodying of this mode in our lived experience. That's why we're doing it. But when I say embedded, what I'm saying is it's like having events in your day trigger as reminders to get into that mode. So, oftentimes with our physician colleagues, it'll be sort of the doorknob practice. So touching the doorknob before you enter the patient's room is your cue to arrive in this moment for this next experience with this patient, not be in the last room or the one you're going to see after. And same thing goes with these postures I was telling you about with our basic combat training folks. So there's many examples in many different professions in which there are things we all do repeatedly in our days, in our work days, and we can leverage those to benefit us to actually re-engage in this mindful mode.
Well, I love that you use the word embedded, not only because it's just a wonderful descriptive term in this sense, but also because it reminds me that you have been working with the military now, teaching mindfulness practice for a number of years. And when some of us first heard that you were working with the military and mindfulness, we're like, oh, military, like how will they really go for this? But it sounds like over a number of years, they have not only taken up these mindfulness practices, but maybe even expanded them. Is that correct?
I would say that's a generous way of thinking about it. It's always a journey. But the good news is that the effort of working with a giant organization like the US military has certainly expanded our capacity to problem solve in a way that many other mindfulness delivery vehicles have just not required. And the starting point for a lot of this was mindfulness-based stress reduction, which, the heroic work of John Kabat-Zinn was the first real opportunity to go from a traditional context to a healthcare setting. And by expanding that further, now, of course, there's a proliferation of mindfulness-based interventions that have done this in almost every domain you can imagine. The work in the military for us has really required us to think carefully regarding two issues. How do you offer training in a manner that is feasible for time-pressured people? And how do you scale up access if you find that that training is beneficial? So the time-efficient aspect really has required a series of studies in which we're trying to get more and more efficient. Most of us in our lives are not thinking for every single thing, how can we be most efficient? But because we're dealing with populations where I might only have 10 minutes or 15 minutes a day, what can I do that would be beneficial in that, as extra time in my day? But the other thing is, how do you make this so that it can be portable and scalable and low tech? Because the nature of who we're dealing with is our target population. All of those solutions have not only helped the military work, but thankfully, I would say it's helped many of the other groups that we work with. So, now based on our military work and the lessons learned, we've been invited for some really fun and very fruitful collaborations with other groups. So, for example, first responders and firefighters, medical and nursing professionals, even large corporations in which they too have the problem of time pressure and scalability of access. So my hope is that we'll continue to benefit from the military work, not only for that group in particular, but for all the other organizational contexts in which those solutions could be applied.
Well, Misha, you brought up work with healthcare professionals, and there's a question from the chat, which I think is relevant. It's kind of a two-part question. So the first part is, how would the attention challenges, which most people experience, differ from the attention challenges that somebody with ADHD would experience? And does the 12 minutes a day of mindfulness training that you're referring to, would that potentially help somebody with ADHD?
Right, because such a great question. So it ends up that when we talked about those three aspects of attention, right, the focusing, the broadening, and then the management, or the metaphors I like to use are like the flashlight, you're focusing, the floodlight, broadening, or kind of like a juggler when you're managing. All three of those systems of attention are what all of us carry around. And some people that have attentional challenges that may dip into the clinical range, called attention deficit disorder, have to do with a dysregulation in the functioning of those systems, one or more of those systems. And it's not always like it doesn't work. It could be that it works almost too well. So hyperfocus, for example, could be a problem with ADD. Lack of focus could be a problem with ADD. Problems knowing what your goal is can be a problem with ADD, et cetera. And there are a variety of other psychological conditions in which attentional challenges can occur. So the question is really, how can you benefit from mindfulness training for people that may have particular attentional challenges? And the way to do this is to do it carefully, meaning that it's not a one solution fits all issue. In the same way that if somebody had, let's say, a tricky ankle or somewhat, sticky knee, whatever you want to call it, you'd not have them go and run for 45 minutes like you might have somebody else that doesn't have any of those issues. You'd take it with care, supporting those aspects that are already strong in them, and pushing those aspects that are already strong in them and supporting those aspects that may need a little bit care. Same goes with attempts to offer mindfulness training to folks with ADD. In the studies that we've done, and now thankfully there's been many researchers that have been doing this, the approach was, Have the goal be the same, improvements in attentional functioning, improvements in mood, etc. But let's see if the journey may need to be different. So instead of starting people off and saying, you're going to sit down, close your eyes, and do 12 to 15 minutes a day, we would start with very active practices, walking meditation, more sensory experience type practices, tasting, smelling, etc. And slowly work up to 12 minutes a day. So in one of our studies with adults with ADD, we didn't get to 12 minutes a day till after 8 weeks in. And they were successful. By the 8th week, they were able to sustain that amount of attention, but it was supported in many ways by many other modes. So the answer is yes, it can be applied and offered, but with care for the particular sensitivities of the population you're working with.
Oh, it's really interesting, Amishi. Thank you for that. And we are coming up on time, but if you don't mind, I do have one question I'd just love to have a sort of end with here, which is, as you are looking at the research that you're doing, the others in the field are doing around mindfulness or other related topics, what is getting you most excited, but also what is making you feel a little bit concerned, if anything?
Yeah, I think it's really an interesting moment right now. When I began this work, it was a pretty lonely space. Like, people thought I was a kind of nuts for trying to study my mindfulness. Nobody, I included, could not really anticipate how much its presence has permeated our popular culture, which is wonderful. And aligned with its growing popularity has been a growing uptick in the popular availability of mindfulness training and the research. So it is a really exciting moment. One aspect of concern for me is that oftentimes when now we use the term mindfulness, we don't know what people are talking about, because they think, having heard a podcast about mindfulness or reading a book or one time focusing on their breath, they're now mindfulness experts on the one hand, or they think that they have to do years and years to get anywhere. So there's just much more range of experience and range of understanding of these concepts and principles. So part of my concern is the need for rigor and clarity regarding what is actually effective, what is evidence informed and effective. Because if people go too low on the sort of dosing, think of it as sort of like, you're really trying to get more in strong physical shape, but your only exercise is walking to your mailbox every day. It's too low dose to actually strengthen your body. Same idea. There may be aspects in which you're engaging, but not quite enough. On the other hand, it could be a fundamental lack of understanding of what we're actually talking about. So rigor in the concepts and in the practices and in the methodology to have effective, beneficial training. And that actually is where I'm most excited. I'm most excited with the challenges that come from greater interest from a variety of sectors. Whether I'm talking to, firefighters, or I'm talking to surgeons, doesn't matter. The fact that there's an interest in there means that it's seen as a tool. And in all of us, in all of our lives, right? Whether it's as our jobs as parents, employees, dedicated members of our community, there are many ways in which we can benefit from tools of exercising and strengthening these aspects of our mind to benefit our lives. But it's not so easy to know exactly what to do. And that's where the dedication and innovation in our science needs to come in. And that's frankly what we're doing. We're coming up with different ways we might incorporate and scale and test the effectiveness of this, so it's a more agile and beneficial tool for more people.
Well, Amishi, I'd like to thank you for being one of those people who's bringing credible and reliable and authentic and very useful mindfulness research to so many people. If folks have not checked out your book, Peak Mind, I could not recommend it more highly. And we'd also love to have folks visit our Peak Mind Resource Hub, which is just kind of puts into action so many of the concepts that you describe so wonderfully in your book. So I'd like to thank my colleague Tara McAvoy for her help this afternoon as we did this webinar, and of course everyone for attending. And finally, and most importantly, Amishi, thank you for your time and your wonderful the conversation. It's been wonderful.
Thanks so much, John. This was a lot of fun.
All right, we will see everyone again soon. Thanks for
right.
joining.